How you guys doing today? Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, I thought we could have some fun today. I know we've been covering a lot on the COVID-19, but I thought we could take a break away and cover some real-life training scenarios. So what I'm going to do today, along with my panel of experts, is I'm going to give them a few training scenarios, and then we are going to go ahead and answer those training scenarios. And guys, if you're watching this, it would be great if you could participate through the comments. So after, we put this up there, I would love to see if you agree or disagree with our panel of experts. And we're going to try our best to showcase both sides of each scenario, because there's more than one side. But again, it's like a damned if you do or damned if you don't. Or I think it was Star Trek, Greg. What's it called in Star Trek?
I believe you're referring to the Kobayashi Maru. So you're going to give us an unsolvable problem, one where there is a no-win situation, and we will show our best side in answering a question that Tony has said has no right answer.
Yes. And what I'm going to do is a lot of them are created as stories, except for the first one. There's Russ, the Vulcan. The first one's going to be a quick one, just to kind of give you an idea of what type of scenarios we have. And then we're going to break into some story mode so I can really get you to relate to the story. Now, before we go to our sponsor, I just want to introduce our panel. So, Russ, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, Russ Hamilton here, 27 years with California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Started at San Quentin way back in 1989. After I retired, in quotation marks, I did more work for a small juvenile detention facility in Northern California. Now I run Keepers of Chaos with a K on Facebook for training and content for anyone that's employed by corrections.
Love it, Russ. Obviously, always a pleasure having you. Greg Piper, do you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Greg Piper, Director of Training for GuardianRFID.com, your software and hardware supporter of everything there is to do with tracking of inmates and following inmates and training our staff to be the most professional and prepared they can possibly be. I've got about 15 years in corrections, and I have an amazing amount of passion for what Tony does and what we all do here, and for the thin gray line, the thin blue line, and I'm just really happy to be here once again this evening.
I'd love to have you again. A big supporter of Guardian RFID. They believe in our message. Ken Daly is a wonderful man who believes that corrections deserves more recognition, and he's doing whatever he can every day to bring not just the profession to the light, but also individual stories about this profession. So I'm honored to be a part of that. I'm also honored to have Greg on with us. Also, by the way, I just texted my wife for iced coffee. Now, she's all the way upstairs. I don't know if she's going to give it to me or not, but I did say, and I think this would work, can I have an iced coffee because I love you? Give it a shot. Let's see. Wait, okay, there's our first test. Who thinks she's going to bring me down an iced coffee? Okay, my boy Gary and Russ. Okay, Greg says no. Well, first shot.
No, I don't think she's going to interrupt you, because your wife knows that you're a professional and you need time away in your man cave. Yeah. I can see that she loves you by the pillows behind you.
Yeah, quarantine, baby. Hey, Gary Cornelius, do you mind? First off, it's a pleasure having you on. It's been a while. Gary Cornelius is actually one of my mentors. When I was first figuring out what I wanted to do with, just in general, how I can get a message across, Gary was an author, already established himself, and he took the time out of a very busy schedule just to sit me down and just tell me exactly what you need to do, where you need to be. And every time I ever had to have a phone call, he was just there for me. So everybody has their mentor. And Gary Cornelius is definitely mine. I'm a big fan of all his books, and I think he's really creating a difference or an impact on the profession, both with experience and also with people that are new coming in. Gary, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Anthony, and it's an honor and a privilege, and I'm in good company here. Like Russ and Greg and you, I have a passion for corrections. My name's Gary F. Cornelius. I worked at the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center, Fairfax County Sheriff's Office, for 27 plus years, from 1978 to early 2005. Retired as a lieutenant. I started working floors, what we called working floors, working tiers, and then I went to classification, work release, programs, directors, planning and policy for the sheriff, and a programs director for the jail. Supervised civilians, became a training instructor, and I instruct for 7 academies in Virginia and wherever else I'm called to do. And thank you for mentioning my books. The one I guess that's given me the most blessings is The Art of the Con, Avoiding Offender Manipulation. And my latest book is The Correctional Officer, A Practical Guide, 3rd edition from Carolina Academic Press. And I do have a passion for corrections and respect for men and women who go into a building where the people don't want to be in there shift after shift after shift. And thank God they come home safe.
I just also would like to dedicate this episode to all the fallen officers that we have through COVID. There was just announced another officer from Rikers Island today. So again, our hearts go out to the families and also the facilities that are affected by these losses. So guys, when we come back from our sponsor, we're going to go ahead and have some fun. And guys, as I mentioned, as we do this, if you want to, whatever, little sidetrack, I'm wondering if my wife's getting me a coffee. I'm looking at the text message. Yeah. Feel free to also give us scenario-based questions you want. You can email any one of us. My email is gangianthony@yahoo.com, or maybe they'll give out their emails later on. If you have some scenarios that you would like us to run by you, and if you would like us to run by the panel, and we'll go ahead and do that, guys. I have a feeling I'm not going to get the coffee. I have a feeling Greg is right, and I'm kind of, my attention's switched. I'm waiting to see the text. I really want a nice coffee. All right, guys, so if you haven't, the show Tier Talks for you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor, and when we come back, we're going to go over our training scenarios.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it, it's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
Guys, inmate manipulation is a course that is highly needed. It's the process that's so slow moving and subtle that you don't realize it's happening. When inmates choose to manipulate, they manipulate our need to react. Situational awareness and insight is going to save your career. It's going to save you from doing foolish things. Listen to your gut. So the more insight we have, the more we can recognize what isn't so overt, and we can correct our behavior before we fall into a trap that we can't get out of. If you allow an inmate to pull you out of your prescribed role, you are opening up a door for a host of problems. Inmate manipulation, the psychology behind inmate manipulation. Available now. Link in description. And we are back. Okay, guys, so most of the training scenarios that I'm going to give you, I'm actually now going to switch it to speaker mode. So when the person speaks, it will zoom in on them. So basically, the training scenarios I'm going to give you, they're kind of like story-based, and I try to make it as realistic as possible. But for the first scenario is just going to be something quick just to get us involved. And basically, guys, the answer is either going to be like a yes or no type thing, like a damned if you do, damned if you don't. So this one's not really story-based, but I'm going to pose the question. And actually, you know what? Let me go back to gallery mode, because I'm actually going to need to see who wants to go first. So, guys, after I give the scenario, I'll call you guys out so we're not always talking over each other. And then what I'll do is when you're done speaking, if someone else wants to compliment what you say, then they'll just raise your hand, and I'll just say, okay, Gary, go ahead, or okay, Greg, go ahead. Okay, so the first scenario is going to be this, just a quick one, just to, get it in, put our feet in the water a little bit, was you're working third shift, right? Very limited staffing, okay? We all know how that is on third shift, right? Very limited staffing. And you only have pretty much one response team in the wings if a code happens, okay? So two things happen simultaneously. An assault on an inmate in one area and a potential suicide happening in another area. And you're the supervisor, and you have to pick which code takes priority. the suicide or the assault? And that's where your team has to go. Who wants to answer that one first?
Russ
Go ahead,
does.
Russ.
I'll always give it a go first. I'm gonna go for the assault first. The reason for that is that's gonna take the most number of officers at the outset. If I end up losing an officer due to a slight injury or something like that, it's going to take less officers at the end to respond over to the suicide one, hopefully, assuming it's a legitimate suicide attempt or try. Because I'm going to need the greatest number of officers to handle two different inmates. Also, I think there's a bigger chance of those two inmates doing some kind of damage to each other than the suicide by itself. If I send to the suicide first, I could have that turn in to some kind of shit show if I end up having an exposure or something like that, and then not have enough bodies to do anything about the assault. The assault takes precedence because it's the one that needs to be stopped the quickest.
Okay, who wants to go second? Greg.
I hate to admit it, but Russ is right. He nailed it right on the head. You got to look. It's a numbers game. If you're going to deal with third shift, you're going to have to pray that the officer who is on scene with your potential suicide person is able to talk them down. Use that tool. Use that best tool in our toolbox. Use that mouth. Use that brain. Try and keep them at bay long enough before you can get some response in there. Because you need numbers when you're dealing with an assault. Because as Gary says in his book, you don't know what's happening. They're probably planning something. Those two fighting could be a plot to get 5 or 6 involved. So I'm going to have to, I hate to admit it, but Russ is right.
What do you got, Gary?
I'm a suicide prevention instructor, but the thing is that I have to go with the assault first, because I think any good supervisor in an institution, he's going to tell the staff, or she's going to tell the staff, that we are very good, Anthony. Cough in your elbow. Very good. Okay. But a good supervisor would tell the staff, look, we're short-staffed, so there might be sometimes you're going to have to do double duty. Not saying there's going to be a suicide or anything, but on a suicide, you can get the medics there, you can get the post office officer there, the tier officer there, and work the problem while everybody else goes to the inmate assault. Because the inmate assault, not only you could have two inmates very badly injure each other, but you don't know how that's going to spread. You don't know.
Now, first off, the reason why I love these answers, I'm just going to comment, is the fact that I love how you're still paying attention to the suicide. You're still having an officer try to talk the inmate down.
Well, you have to.
Yeah, because one of the concerns they had was, you want to run to where there is the greatest potential for loss of life. So is that going to be the assault or the suicide? But either way, as you said, if you have a staff member there trying to counsel the inmate that's trying to kill themselves, then maybe that lowers the probability of the loss of life, and then you can focus more on the assault. So that was the quick one, guys. Now I'm going to read a story. And by the way, my wife did say she is going to get me a coffee. She said, once I get these kids down, and of course, because I'm your slave. Well, it says it right there, guys.
Yeah.
I'm your slave. Yeah.
Wow.
But I just come back and said, thank you, boo, and kisses. I didn't fucking, hey, it is what it is. All right, so here's the first scenario. Now, it's a little bit of a story, guys, so bear with me. And remember, guys, hopefully we can try to see both perspectives. So this one's called, is an officer being insubordinate or following procedure? So it's third shift, and manpower for the night is standard skeleton crew, and emergency code is called. With limited manpower, Sergeant Michael Gall leads the response team to the area of disturbance, a dorm, and then has the team wait so he can evaluate the situation. Situation's brutal. One inmate is on the floor while 10 other inmates are assaulting him. The sergeant with limited manpower decides for safety reasons that he needs a secondary response team. He calls on the radio for 3 unit officers to suit up and come to the dorm to assist. 2 of the unit officers quickly arrive on the scene, but the third never shows. Eventually, the sergeant makes a call to enter the dorm with the response team, and with luck on their side, they're able to control the situation. After the code has been cleared, the sergeant finds his way to the unit where the officer who did not respond was stationed. The sergeant told the officer that he ignored a direct order to respond, and the sergeant now wants the officer to write a report. The officer writes his report, and in it states the order violated policy because it required him to leave his post unmanned. In this case, the sergeant gave an order for more manpower so he can ensure the safety of his team. Direct order was refused, basic insubordination, and the officer who did not show refused the order because he claimed the order went against policy and procedure. Both are pushing for action to be taken. As an administrator, you understand why the sergeant made that call, but you can also see why the officer refused to leave his post. Which action would you take? How would you resolve this conflict? Share in the comments below, because I wrote this. So who wants to go? Let's switch the order first. Let's go to Greg first. You're muted, Greg. You're muted.
There, I'm going to use the little trick you showed me.
Okay.
In front of the line officer, I'm supporting my sergeant. Last order given, you have to support. And I personally have been a line officer who was given a direct order by a supervisor that I, got to be honest with you guys, I absolutely despised him. But come to find out, that rank, that collar, that matters. So you got to do what he says. And so the line officer needs to be reprimanded for not following that direct order. And I, as the administrator, am going to make that case to the line officer with the sergeant present. Then once the line officer is left, I'm going to make sure that the sergeant understands, one, you violated policy, and I'm going to chew him out and make sure that he has the necessary tools next time for this not to be a repeat offense. But I'm going to agree with him. He made the right call because of the potential for loss of life.
Okay. Gary?
I agree with Greg on this because you're looking at two individuals and you don't want to fire them. You want to, they're good officers and the one was following policy, not leaving his post. But then again, there's other people on the squad. They might have to do double duty, come in and lock those inmates down, and so the guy can go. But you have to take, I think that's equal what Greg suggested, taking action on each one. Yep.
Now let's go with Russ first. Russ, what's your thoughts?
So, yeah, I'm going to agree with them, but I'm going to take it one little step further. This individual, he didn't give any feedback to them over the radio or anything else about what he was doing or why he wasn't doing it or asking for a clarification, and he held up the response. So I would say that not just the fact that he was insubordinate, but the fact that he caused there to be a delay in the response is also probably an actionable offense on his part. It sounds to me like, he was trying to drive some point home, and that was not the time to do it. I think absolutely it's the sergeant who's, vested with the power in that situation to maybe take and change that policy a little bit, just merely to try and keep the entire facility safe. It's not always possible to do a perfect job, but it's almost always possible to do a better job than simply leaving things in the status quo like this officer tried to do.
Now, I want to also, something that Greg mentioned that I want to get your opinion on, so I'll go with Russ first and then Gary, was Greg also mentioned that after the subordinate had left, he would also have a talk with the supervisor and basically confront the supervisor on the supervisor asking for policy to be broken. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Well, yeah, I think that's a perfectly legitimate question. I want people that are working in those types of positions like that to be able to justify what their rationale was for doing something, what they did. Why did he break policy? I think in this case, that supervisor, he sounds like he knows what he's doing. It sounds to me like he can justify it. He can articulate, the gravity of the situation and the totality of the circumstance. And that's really about all you can ask from a person. Can't do the impossible, so let him do the next best thing.
Love it. What about you, Gary?
I agree. There's going to be times where you can't do everything by the book, and these types of situations are going to pop up where you have to use discretion, you have to make decisions, and for the greater good. And I agree with Russ on that too.
Yeah, I thought that was a very good note that Greg had mentioned. Greg, you have anything you want to say before we close off on this scenario?
Well, I think it's really important that we remember that The warden or the jail administrator, depending what type of facility you have, they're in charge, sheriff, jail administrator, warden, what have you. And when they hand out those responsibilities to the deputy wardens and then to the captains and then to the lieutenants, who then hand it down to the sergeants, shift supervisors, you are running your area. You're given that responsibility. You need to take a hold of that. And you are then rewarded for appropriate actions. And you also have to have broad enough shoulders to know when you screw up, it's your call. So, yeah, this is why you get to be a supervisor. You make decisions, and hopefully your supervisory staff above you will support your decisions, but you got to know, why did you do it? And I think Russ pointed that out. Yeah, you have to be able to articulate why you made a decision.
Right, and I like what you said also about supervisors. Technically, they're in those positions to also employ some discretion, which means once in a while they may have to wiggle in and out of policy in an effort to bring things back to policy. And I think that's what the supervisors, sometimes they really have to make decisions that, okay, it may not be policy at this point, but again, if I can justify it, like Russ said, like this is the point where maybe policy failed, and that gives us a chance to relook at that. Now, touching on that, I'm going to touch on the policy question. So we have a training officer, Wanda Collins, has prepped herself for the new recruits who are standing outside the facility waiting to begin their correctional careers. She is ready for the onslaught of questions that they have, and she knows about it. In the course of her career, she knows that these questions tend to become repetitive. She believes the questions are so repetitive that she has formulated the perfect responses for every question that could be asked. So Collins picks up the recruits and begins her routine tour. As expected, the recruits ask questions that she's heard before. They range from safety and security to the specific crimes of the inmates housed within the facility they're touring. Today is going just as smoothly as planned. As the tour comes to a conclusion, one of the recruits calls Collins to the side and says he has one more question. She asks, "What is it?" And he replies, if we follow policy all the time, don't we become predictable? And if so, what can we do to become less predictable? I guess what I'm trying to ask is there a way to be more creative with policy so we can avoid predictability? Collins is at a loss for words. This question has never been asked before. How would you answer that question? Go ahead, Gary, you go first.
Okay. I know in my trainings, I talk about a thing I call systematically unsystematic, where the inmates know how predictable you are. They know when you do your counts. They know when you do your feedings and so forth. They know how the place is staffed. But you have to be somewhat unpredictable in your rounds, where you check, how many people you search, where you search. You have to give the illusion that you're everywhere at once. And that's how I would answer that. Yeah, the inmates are going to know that. That's the way the inmates do time. We all know that. But you have to be very unpredictable in the way you do your job. You got to pop up everywhere. I tell my classes that the inmates should always be looking over their shoulder and looking for where you are.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it, Gary. That's spot on. What's it called? Unpredictable predictability or something?
No, systematically unsystematic, and you can have that.
All right, I'm gonna borrow that term. Hey, Russ, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I really liked the way he put that. I came up with something similar a long time back in my career, where I called it having a patternless pattern. So anyway, the way I would tend to look at this is that you have a lot of different competing events that happen over the course of a shift. And some of those things are guided by policy, and some of them are guided by tactics. The easiest way to really go about making sure that you're not predictable is to change up your tactics rather than your strategy, because the strategy is the overarching thing that you're just trying to accomplish. Tactics are the way you accomplish it. So you can change your tactics without necessarily changing your strategy. And so that's just my own personal way of trying to look at it. There's some things that you can't help. There's some things that you're always going to be somewhat repetitive in. But along the way, if you can find ways to change things up, to take a different approach, to do things differently, that's within your tactics, that's much easier than just trying to look at it and think that you're going to change strategy, because your strategy is almost always going to remain the same. Safety and security, prevent escapes, prevent losses to life, prevent violent acts.
Love it. It's funny because the way we're going to this question, it's going to lead right into the next one. Hey, Greg, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, this is maybe a bad time in everybody's life to use this analogy, but I like to use the analogy of a cruise ship, okay? When you get on the cruise ship at the beginning, what you do between, if you leave from Miami and you're going to go all the way to, let's say, Buenos Aires, okay? The ship's going to go there no matter what. It's going from Miami to Buenos Aires. You don't have any choice in the matter. But what you do while you're on that cruise ship is entirely up to you. You want to eat, you want to go dancing, you want to play shuffleboard, you want to drink, whatever you want to do, as long as you stay on the ship, you're fine. So what happens during the course of a shift and during the course of a career? Hey, as long as you stay on the cruise ship, don't jump over the railing, okay? Don't try and go in the captain's quarters and steer the boat. But along the way, whatever you want to do, as long as it meets the criteria, it's fine, because everybody's going to be different. Everybody's going to do things slightly different. That's where we get into procedures and tactics. Like Russ said, some people a little more physical. I'm sure, Russ, what are you, 6'4"? You probably walked in a room and the whole pod would get quiet. I'm a little smaller. I had to, use my mouth a little bit more to gain control. So it's doing what comes naturally for you, as long as you stay on the ship during the cruise.
I love it. I like that scenario. You always are good taking out good scenarios. So, but I do got to ask you something. So we have systematically, was it unsystematically systematic?
I'll text it to you.
Text me that. And then we have patternless patterns.
Yeah.
What's yours, Greg?
I don't really have a cool expression like my two esteemed colleagues.
Oh man, no, I think these are oxymorons. Actually, not you guys. I'm sorry. I'm talking about that. I'm talking about the opposites. All right, guys. So I want to touch into that same question we just asked. This kind of touches into something that relates to that. So now let's apply it. We answered it generally. Now let's apply it. So Tyler Johnson. Oh, thanks, Gary. He just texted to me. Tyler Johnson, an inmate at XYZ Correctional Center, wants to control where he's housed. Every time he's placed in a housing unit he doesn't like, Johnson alleges he's going to commit suicide. This action forces staff to follow policy and place Johnson back in a close supervision unit where he'll remain on constant watch. While Johnson is housed in this unit, he informs mental health staff members that he has no plan to commit suicide and was only attempting to control where he's housed. Staff in the mental health unit then informs the administration of the facility that Johnson is merely playing the system, but abiding by policy, Johnson's moved again to another housing unit. Custody staff informs the administration that a trend has started, and that if they continue to entertain this inmate's apparent whims, other inmates may also begin to follow in his footsteps. What should they do to prevent to prevent a number of inmates from claiming they will kill themselves in order to control where they are housed? What should administration tell their staff to do in this sort of scenario? Okay, so Greg, you go first.
All right, so I'm going to base it on two different options. We have option A and option B. Option A is what the feds do. I have a few colleagues in the federal system, and they use what they call diesel therapy to resolve those issues. They put a guy on a bus every time he causes a problem, and they bus his you-know-what halfway across the country to another facility. They may go to Nashville, then they may end up in Leavenworth, then they may end up in Wyoming or Texas. They diesel therapy him until he settles down, because that causes the family a lot of problems and issues. That's option A. Option B, you're stuck. You can't transfer him for some reason. Option B would then put me in a position where if he's going to claim, and I know Gary's going to get on me because he's a suicide prevention guy. If I've got a guy who says he's going to commit suicide, I'm putting him in a cell with 2 or 3 other guys who are also claiming they're going to commit suicide. You spend 2-3 days with 3 other naked guys, you don't want to be in there anymore. So I'd either transfer him or I'd put him in with other actual mental health cases, and we'll see just how he responds to people who actually do want to kill themselves.
All right, let's go to Gary.
Greg, that was good. Diesel therapy. I like that. What you have to show the inmate is that, okay, this is what you have said. We have zero tolerance. Every jail has zero tolerance for suicide threats. And we will put you in restrictive housing. Now, that could be isolation, or it could be, we had holding areas with a few other inmates on suicide watch. And I remember someone said, well, there's no TV in here. And I said, well, that's, you're talking about killing yourself. So we're not going to worry about you getting TV and things like that. And after a couple of days, usually they come around because they see what they know what they're not getting. But the zero tolerance policy, and other inmates see that too. And you kind of have to talk it up and say, well, if you go on suicide watch, you're not going to get TV. It's going to be limited this, limited that. We're going to check you every few minutes. But you said the word suicide, so we got to take you at your word. And usually that wears them out. And then you have some that I've dealt with some that every time they came in, they were threatening suicide. And once again, that's one of the questions I get in my classes and webinars is, what do you do if you have someone that's threatening it over and over and over and over? And I said, zero tolerance policy. You can't take that chance. You cannot take that chance on that manipulative inmate stringing himself up, waiting for you to come down the hallway to cut him down. So he gets a little sympathy, trip to the dispensary, trip to the hospital, whatever it is. Zero tolerance policy. And mental health is a big factor too. And I know in my jail, mental health, we had mental health there every day. Mental health staff was there every day until early evening and on call on weekends. And we were fortunate, but a lot of jails, they don't have mental health there every day due to funding or whatever. And but zero tolerance policy, and hopefully the inmate just gets tired. And if the other inmates see that you mean business, it's like if you've seen that movie, Meet the Parents, when he says bomb on an airplane, you said bomb, and right away, zero tolerance policy on it.
Right, I like that, Gary. And also, I want to mention something before we go to Russ is that we call it the boy that cries wolf, and in the story, they stop coming. Well, we can't do that in corrections, and the concern is if the inmate doesn't get the attention, they will step it up, and in an effort to be foolish, they're going to wind up taking their own lives. Hey, Russ, what's your thoughts on that scenario?
Yeah, I loved what Greg had to say there. We had a very similar feature in California Department of Corrections. We called it something very similar. It was bus therapy. And so when you have those kind of resources where you can send someone to Pelican Bay, and then from Pelican Bay down to Richard J. Donovan down in San Diego and all over the place, it takes the fire out of them in a hurry. Having said that, not every place has that kind of resources to be able to do that, but that's a great feature. One of the other things you can do is, if you have the ability to do this, is put that guy in the exact spot in the state or wherever where he doesn't want to be, as far from his family. If it takes 6 months or whatever, let other inmates see that his particular play did not pan out, because that's what we're really trying to achieve here. It's not so much dealing with him, it's dealing with all the other inmates that are going to get the same stupid idea buried in their head and stop them from doing that nonsense. So if you have to send him away and put him in a way and let people know that he ended up where he ended up because of the things he was pulling, there's other ways for them to address their issues, grievances, good behavior, other things like that.
Love it. Now we're going to go to the next one. We got a few guys. So Officer Smith was just placed onto the threat suppression team, and for the first time in years, he feels excited about his new position. This new position will require him to be proactive and help with investigations and intelligence sharing. He's even excited about the chance to communicate with other law enforcement agencies. Right now, Officer Smith is on cloud 9. The first day on the job, Smith finds himself training with the TST team leader, Sergeant Johnson. Sergeant Johnson's a veteran who has over 20 years in corrections with 13 years on the TST team. The first day of training consists of interviewing and intelligence gathering. As Smith sits down to observe Sergeant Johnson begin his interview with an inmate, Smith sees something he doesn't like. The inmate in question asks Sergeant Johnson, "What's in it for me?" Sergeant Johnson, with a smile, says, "Same as last time, brother. You give me what I need, and we can discuss what you need." Once the inmate leaves, Smith turns to Sergeant Johnson and asks, "So what's that about?" Sergeant Johnson replies, "You have to give a little to get a little." With that in mind, Smith continues on with his day. As his shift comes to an end, Smith begins to feel deeply troubled. If an inmate's given something every time he gives up intel, Why not lie and come up with false intel for a reward? If this is the case, the sergeant's probably being played and control of the situation may be at the hands of the inmate. So here's the question Officer Smith needs answered. Should the inmate be rewarded for giving up intel? He figures if they constantly get rewarded, inmates will learn to take advantage of the situation and gain control of the sergeant. Is there another way of gathering intel without doing a trade-off? Go ahead, Russ.
Okay, this one obviously really is very troubling because you know what? I'm not a big fan of giving inmates rewards for doing what's ostensibly the right thing, of course, giving us intel. But there are some times where that can't be helped. But by the same token, if you always make that, the only way that that type of transaction gets done, then that's the only way you'll ever get to that transaction. And you'll never learn to develop the other methods that are going to help you leverage inmates with all kinds of different intelligence that you need to do. I've had, let me see how I can put this without giving away what actually happened. But I had a friend of mine who was involved in a really huge deal at the federal level with the FBI and the whole 9 yards. And it all hemmed on doing a favor for an inmate. Now, in this case, that was legit and it turned out and it worked well and it got a very, very bad man taken, off of the streets. But that doesn't mean that you should rely on that every time. I'm not comfortable with it. And I've had supervisors that would get intel from inmates and over trade them little baubles of stuff where we would take away contraband and he would give it back. And what did he always say? He always said that he was building rapport. And that's all he ever did, though. He just built rapport for a bunch of really bunk information that we could have figured out within 5 minutes just by going and looking at our yard anyway. So this is kind of one of those things where, it's a real difficult dichotomy. I wouldn't say that you never do it, but I also wouldn't say that you always do it.
And Russ, the reason why I wanted you to go first is because this is your background. This is what you did. This is what you did in San Quentin. So I thought this would be interesting because it would hit home with you. But I think it's a great question because I think a lot of people deal with this right now. And I'm sure the concern is if I reward inmates, then you're also going to have other inmates coming out of the wind saying, hey, if you want to get cigarettes, if you want to get this or you want to get that, go ahead and say this is happening. Okay, Gary, what's your thoughts?
The best informant, in my view, is the one that wants very little or next to nothing. He just doesn't want to get his neck in a noose, so to speak. He doesn't want to have anything go down and him go down with it. I think, I worked in a jail, but I would be I wouldn't be so quick to promise him anything. Say, okay, thanks a lot. I'm going to check it out. We'll get back to you. See if you can corroborate it with another inmate or something else that's going on. But I think it's a slippery slope. If you give the inmate something right away, word gets around. Right.
Well said, Gary. Also, as you said, it's the precedence that's being created. What's your thoughts on that, Greg?
Well, first of all, we have to distinguish between what are we giving the offender. I would never give them something that would be considered contraband. So if cigarettes are not allowed in the facility, then I'm not giving them cigarettes. We always had, as corrections counselors and as supervisors, we had a drawer of crunch in the office. We had some honey buns, we had some bags of coffee, and we had some good deodorant and, stuff they could get already on store or maybe from the chaplain, things that were allowed inside the facility. And no, it wasn't the kind of thing that it was every single time. But if you had a guy who came in and you knew his stuff was good, he voluntarily gave you information. Maybe he did get an extra phone call when I was a counselor. He got an extra phone call to his grandma. So there was a give and take. You don't promise anything. You work with your staff because I think if you're automatically saying, hey, you tell me who's making the hooch, I'll give you 5 honey buns. Well, then you put yourself out there. But if somebody says, hey, they're making hooch down the street, the reason they're telling you that, guys, the reason they're telling you that they're making hooch on the next tier over is because they're making hooch and they don't want to get caught. or, it's one gang giving information on the other gang. Somebody's always trying to get over. The information is never altruistic. It's not some guy who's telling you, oh, it's just because no, there's always an ulterior motive inside the prison. But that's okay, because all we're trying to do is stay ahead of the curve. So if it's good information, once in a while, there's no reason why. If I got some extra coffee, if I got some extra honey buns, some extra soups, that they can't see their way to that guy's possession. If it turns out and he's not asking for it, but I have no reason to not reward him.
Yeah, that's a great balance between what Gary said and what Russ said, Greg. And also, one thing I would like to recommend, I would like to comment something on this is, like I think Greg touched on it, is you got to ask that inmate that's giving you the information, why are you giving it to me? I mean, interrogate them just as you would interrogate the information that they're giving you, or the people that they're giving you the information about. Why are you giving this to me? Because again, they could be giving it to you because there is a benefit from it. Like, maybe they're running a market and right now this other gang is getting in their way. So, you're working on this gang and, it clears way for them to do their market. All right. So next question. We got a few more guys. Do you guys like the questions so far? Are they good?
Yeah. Yep.
I think so. Wait, Russ, what'd you say? You're muted, Russ. They're good?
I said, they're great, man. I'm
cool.
happy.
I wrote all these back in 2015. So
yeah, I don't like the way they're written, but the questions are good.
And this is show you proof by Anthony Gangi. I'm reading from all my correction scenarios.
Of course they are.
Yeah. A little self-promotion. You can find these on Corrections 1. All right. As the shift comes to an end, Officer Smith finds himself frantically looking for the keys to the unit. He begins to retrace his steps and runs his daily routine through his mind. Nervously, he tours the wings of the unit and comes up empty. And just as he's about to lose hope, Inmate Johnson approaches Officer Smith and places the keys on his desk. With a deep breath of relief, Officer Smith thanks the inmate for finding the keys and then orders the inmate to go back to his bed area. As the relief officer comes in for the shift change, Officer Smith tells him what just occurred. In response, Officer Jones calls the inmate to the front of the unit and tells the inmate to grab a seat in the day area. With concern, Officer Smith asks, "What are you doing?" Officer Jones replies, "I'm calling the supervisor and sending that inmate to lock." In shock, Officer Smith says, "Why would you do that? He's the one who gave me back the keys." Officer Jones, in frustration, states, "He could also be the one that took the keys. This could be a game that the inmate is playing, and I'd rather err on caution." Officer Smith believes the inmate actually helped him find his keys and therefore should not be punished. Officer Jones, being unsure if the inmate helped or actually took the keys as a way to employ some type of game, which is like obligation, wants the inmate removed from the unit and sent to lock. Is Officer Smith gullible, or is Officer Jones right to err on the side of caution, as this could be a setup? Gary Cornelius, you go first.
I was a manipulation trainer, I think, setup. The inmate comes to him and says, "Hey, I found your keys." Makes him look good, makes the officer relieved. The officer should, I always thought, don't try to dodge stuff. Go to your supervisor and say, "Hey, man, I lost my keys. This inmate found them." It's out in the open. The supervisor will think more of him when he says that. As a supervisor, if somebody came up and said, "Hey, I screwed up. I have that person." I respected that person. But I do think, the circumstances got to be looked into, how those keys ended up missing.
So you think, obviously, and we'll go to Greg next, then Russ, is obviously the concern here is also the officer knows that if that inmate goes to lock, the officer is probably going to get charged for losing those keys regardless. What's your thoughts on this, Greg?
Well, first off, are we talking about what to do with the offender, or what are we doing with the officer dynamic? Because as an officer, I learned the hard way first couple of years in, had some things happen, kind of ran the other way, kind of hoped it would fall into the radar. Learned early on that when you do something wrong, you run straight at that wave. You run at it as hard as you can, because if you show that you're harder on yourself than your supervisory staff or administration can be, and you let your supervisor know before the administration finds out, it's going to turn out much better for you. You may get stung initially, but it's always going to work out better if you run straight at that wave when you do something wrong. Now, as far as the keys go, if the inmate brings me the keys, I don't know whether or not he found them or I left them or what have you. He's already in basically lockup. I mean, he's in general population. But at this point, I'm going to note that he found my keys, and let's do some research. Let's do some video. Let's go back and trace my steps as best we can, figure out, did I lay him somewhere on camera, and figure out who did pick him up. Yes, I'm thinking manipulation, but at the same time, I'm not going to lock him up without proof, because remember, and I may be in the minority here, what we are is corrections professionals. We're trying to correct behavior and try and show these people that not everybody in a uniform is a POS.
Well said. Okay, Guy, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I agree with Greg. You got to look at the circumstances. I mean, one of the cardinal rules that I got drilled into me from day one is never trust an inmate was the first thing. Never lose your keys. Never lose your keys. And even though he got the keys back, you have to look at the circumstances. You've got to figure out what happened here.
Right. And before we go to Russ, I did mention the feeling of obligation, because having said that, now the inmate, kind of gives it to the officer, and the officer is relieved because in his mind, he's thinking, oh my God, I could have been charged for this. So he could be looking at the inmate as sort of like a hero, technically, because he just stopped him from getting charged. And to me, that's a concern, because now you may have a favor that has to be paid back between the officer and that inmate. So just curious perspective there. Russ, what's your thoughts?
Okay, so this is one of those things where this may not be the kind of things that's necessary in every case like this, but it's the kind of thing that you have to take into account when you're developing critical thinking skills. So my thought process on something like this is, first of all, what's the worst possible set of scenarios in this? The worst possible sets that I can think of is okay, maybe the inmate made an impression while those keys are gone. Maybe he accessed an area while these keys were gone that allowed him to get to some sort of contraband. Maybe he accessed an area where there were some staff members and those people are bleeding or dying or dead already. Maybe somebody used those keys besides this inmate to already get outside the facility. This is a chain that we have to pay attention to, maybe in this situation, maybe not, depending on how things are placed in this facility or whatever. But what we've got to do from this point forward right now is we've got to get that inmate probably over to lockup. But before we do all that, we have to lock everything down. We have to take accountability for the inmates. We have to do a count. We have to take accountability for all of the staff members potentially. We have to look to see where any sort of contraband could have been stolen from that these keys go to. And the list just kind of goes on and on and on. Now, would you necessarily have to take all those steps in every situation like this, depending on how long they were gone? Well, maybe not. But at the same time, when you're developing and you're teaching and you're getting other people to think about critical incidents and critical thinking skills, those are the types of possibilities and probabilities that you have to take into account in order to keep your facility safe. So at the bare minimum, I would probably want to do a count.
All right, anybody want to complement that thought before we go to the next question? Obviously, we all agree with Russ, or does anybody else want to add to that?
Absolutely. I think Russ, he went down that, I don't want to call it a bunny trail, but he absolutely took it to the furthest extreme, which you have to do because we are in a worst case scenario kind of business. So yeah, again, it's going to depend where the key's gone 3 to 5 minutes, where the key's gone half a shift. Because if the keys were gone half a shift and you didn't tell anybody, you just got really nervous and they were gone for 4 or 6 hours, we got bigger fish to fry. We have a whole different animal here. Now, if they were gone for 4 or 5 minutes, maybe like Russ said, maybe they got into a supply closet or they just went somewhere and they got something out of a locker. But yeah, it's going to depend on the length of time the keys were gone. I agree.
All right, Gary, anything else? Are you good? Or go
No, I think that sums it up. Yep.
All right, next one. We got a few more left, guys. I'm saving the best ones for last, by the way, the ones that are more controversial. Inmate Christine Filer is pregnant. Unfortunately, even though she's pregnant, she continues to act up and still poses a major threat to herself and others. Today, Warden Ryan Francis finds himself in need of some advice. In preparation for a possible cell extraction, he wants to implement a policy that relates directly to the use of force for pregnant inmates. This policy will cover restraints, cell extractions, and transportation. He wants to make sure he puts together a policy that includes protecting the life of the unborn child without limiting the power of the response team. He has tried looking up past policies and can't find anything on the use of force on pregnant inmates. He has called numerous institutions and there has been no response. So he now turns to you guys. He's turning to you guys. He's asking you. He's a big fan of Tear Talk. His major concerns are, should pregnant inmates be treated differently when all types of use of force is applied? If so, will this difference limit the power of the response team? If there is a need for cell extraction, can a shield be used? When restraining the inmates, can they be handcuffed and can they be shackled? And how should the restraints be placed? And what should the use of and what about the use of a chemical agent? Warden Francis has a lot of concerns that needs to be addressed. So far, his avenues of resources have been rather limited, so he now goes to the front line. Based on your experience, how would you write this policy? And most importantly, how would you safely protect all lives involved, including the unborn baby? So I'm going to go to Gary Cornelius on this first. He's used to implementing policies, creating policies. So Gary, what's your thoughts on this? Because I did some research, guys. When I wrote this question back in 2015, there were hardly any policies on dealing with pregnant inmates.
Well, I think that in corrections, yeah, I see you grinning there.
It's a hard question.
I see you grinning. In corrections, it's hard for me to believe that you can't get guidance from somebody. The National Commission on Correctional Health Care. You go on Corrections 1, you go to Lexipol, you go to Guardian. There's people there that can give you guidance. It's controversial. I think you're going to have to get some really good medical heads on this, an obstetrician on this, and also your team leaders and your members of your extraction team. Because if they have to go in there, this is one area or situation that's going to have a lot of training, because you can't put somebody on the floor and press a shield on them, even though they might be spitting at you and trying to bite you and all that, because if that baby is injured, you know the lawyers are going to be there.
And Gary, by the way, Gary, so far your answer is spot on. Like, I just want you to know that, even though I hit you with this because no one knew the questions we were going to ask, I think that's great how you mentioned to involve medical along with the response team.
Yeah, because, you know, when I started at the jail, it was 1978, and we didn't have the internet. We didn't have Lexipol. We didn't have these good folks. You know, they were there, but we couldn't get the information. It was so cumbersome. But now you have a lot of people. You have a lot of people in corrections that can give guidance on a policy like this. And it's going to have to be a lot of training, You just can't go in and just wrestle a woman to the floor, so to speak, and restrain her and keep everybody safe, because that in the womb is another life. And if it goes to a civil court liability-wise, you're going to have to trot out all this training, all these deliberations, all this information gathering when this policy was written. And it's not going to be written overnight. It's going to take time.
A great answer. And then obviously that training would matter in court to make sure that they know that the people were properly trained. Unfortunately, you're dealing with human behavior, and sometimes the unpredictable happens, but that training holds weight. Russ, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, you know, this is one of those kind of tasks that I would try and weasel out of if it were at all possible. But by the same time, and I kind of say that jokingly, because I actually enjoy being given challenges that are difficult. Some of the things that I've seen over the years, and I've dealt with very, very few female inmates actually, but I did some when I was in juvenile. You know, sometimes we have to be careful that we don't exclude some potential solutions to things by just saying, no, we're not going to do that. One of the scenarios when we were planning to open up the juvenile facility was we're saddled with a law that says that we can't place restraints on pregnant inmates who are in labor of any kind. And so that was kind of like, okay, well, you know what? That sounds really good and really caring in a world where, you know, everything is, you know, unicorns and rainbows and stuff. But what if you were to have an inmate who was determined to kill themselves? And under those circumstances like that, you couldn't place, any restraints on them. So you have to hold them, physically restrain them during the whole pregnancy, or not the pregnancy, but during the labor. That's not an option. That's not a solution either. And, I really liked what Gary, had to say. You want to go dig up those experts, those subject matter experts, the guy who really knows about every single kind of restraint out there. He mentioned the obstetrician. You want to get those two guys talking to each other. You want to try and think out what all the possible, the entire spectrum of the scenarios that could happen that might make you want to write in some sort of exception for what's going on under a particular circumstance. Now that's a really huge project to have to bite off. And that's why, I wouldn't want to try and sit down and write it in an evening. That's the kind of thing I would want several months to try and mull over and consider and try and come up with something that's comprehensive enough, yet, is, brief enough that I can train it to all of my people. So, it's something that I would like to take on in a challenge, but I certainly would not want, I would certainly, kind of pity anyone else that tried to take it on. Better you than me. But like I say, at the same time, I kind of would dig it. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Well, first off, it's an amazing 2 cents. And also, before we get to Greg, sometimes the woman that's pregnant, she's endangering the baby herself. So you may have to take extreme measures to protect her from herself. But Greg, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, having spent almost 3 years in a jail setting, we had a lot of females. You'd be surprised, even in the short time I was there, a lot of females who showed up pregnant. What would happen is they would, they'd do what they're doing on the street, and suddenly they would get pregnant, and then they would break their probation or their parole and end up back in jail because that way the county had to pay for it. So we did have, we dealt with a lot of pregnant females, especially when you're going to court holding, where we had them shackled and handcuffed. We never shackled a pregnant female. We had those that were mentally unstable. And fortunately, this is 2020 now. There are a lot more resources out there for restraint systems than there was. I know when Gary started, things have changed a lot. There's the RAP and the different types of restraints, much more, you hate to say humane, but much gentler ways to restrain people in certain situations. But absolutely, I don't want to rekindle what the guys have already said. Yeah, you've got to have a team together. You got to get a committee together of experts, people with pieces of paper on the wall like Gary's got, so that when it does go to trial, you have some expert people who created this policy with the best intentions in mind. You're going to have mistakes, and people are going to learn from those mistakes, and we're going to continue to refine those policies as we go, but we're going to put the best minds in a room, make a policy, and run with it, and then train on it.
I love it. Now, guys, I have about three questions left, maybe 4, but I think it's 3. And, guys, we're open to taking more scenarios like this. So if you're watching this and you have a scenario, email me at gangianthony@yahoo.com, gangianthony@yahoo.com. Give us what the scenario is, and we'll do another show like this. I think this is actually fun, but believe it or not, there's a lot of good information. Even though we're having fun, there's some good information that's being passed. And out of curiosity, before I go to the next question, does your facility have a use of force policy for pregnant women? Maybe that's something we should think about. A lot of people don't think about that, but maybe that's something we should think about it, because in 2015, there wasn't any. All right, so next one. Officer Peter Williams is a diligent officer who comes to work on time and goes above and beyond the performance of his duties. Today, his post is in a close supervision unit where he has 108 inmates under his direct supervision. 9 of them are 15-minute close watches. The 15-minute close watches inmates are scattered throughout the unit. Williams never complains about the amount of work he's given, but the addition of these close watches stretches him a little too much. He calls for his area supervisor and explains that his current assignment is overwhelming. He can't properly maintain vigilance on his whole unit if he has to constantly monitor 9 close watch inmates every 15 minutes. He then asks for a second officer to assist him with the close watches so he can maintain proper vigilance of his unit as a whole. The supervisor takes note of his concerns but states he does not have enough manpower to support that request. That being said, if the officer states he cannot do his duties responsibly, The supervisor will be forced to pull him and find someone who can. So Williams quickly changes the subject, and eventually the supervisor heads out of the unit. As the night progresses, another officer, Sean Connolly, stops by Williams' unit and quickly sees that Officer Williams has a lot on his hands. He tells Williams he should be realistic in the logbook and make note of the exact times he does his tours, which realistically cannot be done every 15 minutes. Williams, with concern, states, if I put the right time down, they'll have me pulled for not doing my job effectively, and discipline will follow. In agreement, Connolly states that's possible, but you still can't lie. Due to the budget cuts, these type of circumstances are happening every day where officers are being forced to choose the lesser of two evils. In this scenario here, what are the likely outcomes Officer Williams can face, and what is the best advice to give him? So I'm going to go with Greg first.
So if only, Tony, there was a system whereby we could electronically know exactly what an officer was doing throughout their entire shift. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that obvious plug. So yeah, I know that, and because I go to these facilities who have been using paper logs for so long, and I always use the joke that we've been using paper logs since Paul and Timothy were in jail in the New Testament. And by the way, Gary, you did a great job watching those guys when they were in jail back in the day.
That was a shock, Gary.
Ooh, that hurt.
But this is 2020,
Must
and
be the beard.
facilities to use electronic monitoring because it will give us exact representations. I tell staff, never, ever, ever lie in your logbook. I don't care if you're late. If you can articulate why you were late, you were late. And if you continue to show that you're late, but you're doing your job, that's so much better. You lie in your logbook and pencil whip a logbook, that is a felony offense, and that is just unacceptable. We are trying to be above reproach, and we're trying to change behaviors of our offenders, so we certainly can't show that we're going to break the law and do things wrong. So an electronic logging system would be absolutely the perfect world, so that you just go around, do your checks, you show exactly what you're doing when you do it, and if they're late, then we have to figure out why, if it's a consistent pattern. But it's not just you, it's any officer that works that unit, then obviously it's a unit issue, not an officer issue. But if you don't have an electronic logging system, then you have to put the exact times that you did your jobs at the time it happened. You can't falsify logs.
Great job, Greg, by the way. Good, Garrett.
Yeah, thanks for that comment about my age, Greg. Oh, I forgot. My Geritol is empty. You know. Yeah, but anyway, this reminds me of back in the 80s. Yes, I was working back in the 80s. Okay, I went to an NIC school on suicide prevention. That's what got me interested in being a trainer for that. And I asked one of the instructors who was a lawyer, I said, in my jail, that we were renovating the jail, I'm one guy on the post. I got people getting booked in, booked out, got to give them their property, got to search them, got to get them on the phone. I have people on suicide watch. I am running my keister off. And what if, because that's how we build training, is what if one kills himself back there? Can I use the legal excuse or excuse for short staffing? And he said, no. He said, because you might get a judge on a lawsuit that says that you have to do your job, do it the best you can, short-staffed or not short-staffed. You have to get it done. So in this case, it's proper for the officer to bring that to the supervisor's attention. I think he should. That maybe they could arrange the housing a little better, all in a closer area, make it easier on the officer and so forth. But you have to get it done. And like Greg said, you cannot lie on your log or your floor, what we used to call floor sheets. You make a check, that is the time you make a check. Now we have electronic monitoring, the CCTV, the systems like Guardian that can tell when an officer did what, where he or she was. But you can't, there's just some, I tell my classes, there's sometimes you just have to do it. And you run your butt off all over that jail, but you have to get it done. And you don't lie.
Well, obviously, these scenarios, they hit home because they're true accounts. I know people have gone through this, and I remember the questions, and I wrote a little bit of a scenario based on what they said. And believe it or not, they felt that they were in an impossible situation because the supervisor did say, you got to get it done. And if you don't get it done, you're going to get charged for that, even though the officer felt it wasn't within his resources to complete that assignment. Okay, Gary.
But the thing is that there are subordinates that are hotheads, okay? And they're going to, if I can use the term bitch, they're going to bitch and gripe and moan and groan and get sarcastic. Yeah. And I think what you have to do is professionally and maturely bring this to the supervisor's attention that something has to be worked out in this unit. They're scattered all over. I got all this to do. You mean, put the heads together. I tell people wear stripes and they wear bars in their collar and railroad tracks in their collar and eagles and oak leaves, and they're paid the big bucks. So somebody should sit down and get the line officer's input on how this could be made better before the temptation of just lying on your logbook or just falsifying a document. No, that's not good.
You know what? Before we go to Russ, with just the four of us here, so I have 18 years in. Greg had what, 15? Russ, how many years for you?
Aggregate of about 30.
All right, so real quick, 30 plus, I'm sorry, guys, I'm in corrections. I got to do math. And then how many for you, Gary?
75.
No, not 70. I was going to add that. How many you got, Gary?
Total police work before the jail, total altogether from police dispatcher to jail retiree, 32.
Do you know, guys,
95.
just the four of us, you got it. We have 95 years of experience here.
I'll round it off for aggravation, make it 100.
Yeah, so close to 100. Russ, what's your thoughts on that question, Russ?
You know, as a supervisor, your job is to be able to make your subordinates successful at what they do. And success is not equaled by cutting corners or, doctoring the books or, those types of things. You want to go in there, someone, has a legitimate concern about that. You need to find a way to help them, and not just help them, but help them immediately. Maybe that means moving all of these people that are on these 15-minute watches together. Maybe that will do for now. But, by the other token is, obviously the best thing would be to try and get some type of electronic tracking, some type of, electronic documentation. Because what electronic documentation can do for you is it holds the officers accountable because they have to do those. But what else it does, it holds the facility and the administrators accountable because it shows whether those officers are actually capable of being able to conduct those type of rounds in a manner where they can still do all the other things they need to do. That will ferret that out and show where the real shortcomings are. So, that's my 2 cents worth. Me, I'm going to try and do something for that officer because I just can't leave him to, do your best and maybe you will or won't get fired. That's not what a good supervisor does.
I think.
Yeah, I like what you said too. We got both. So I like what you said too, Russ, about the holding the administrative level responsible. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go to Greg first and then Gary. So get Greg.
One of the things that I think you can do as an administrator or at least a supervisor is maybe even reach out to mental health or medical and say, hey, do these 9 guys really need to be on 15-minute checks? Let's check that, because I've been to plenty of facilities where I'm walking around and they got 15-minute checks on sleep apnea guys. They got 15-minute check on this guy and that guy. And I'm like, he's got all his property, he's got all his gear, and he's on a 15-minute check. 15-minute checks are supposed to be for high-risk individuals. You got guys on 15-minute checks for no reason. So let's make sure they're on their appropriate 15-minute checks, and then absolutely move everybody into to the same area so they're right in a row. It'll make it much easier for the staff.
Yeah, by the way, when I posed that question, I did that purposely because the scenario I got was one of the concerns were that the inmates were in the regular housing unit and the officer was given 15-minute watches. And the problem was because they were in the regular housing, not a specialized unit, basically the inmates were spread back into the cells that they originally lived in before they acted, did whatever it was that they did. So I love what you said. Like, the fact is bringing these inmates together and also following up mental health. Like, how long has this guy been on a 15-minute watch? And if that's the case, why is he in a general housing unit? But this is what some people are actually going through. Sometimes the watches actually go from a constant watch of, literally second by second constant watch to the 15-minute observation being done back in the housing unit, as opposed to the step down being done where it should be, which would still be in some form of a stabilization unit where the person can earn their way back to GP. But because of lack of manpower or lack of spacing, the person will go in some cases from the close observation, and then the 15-minute watch is actually done in the GP area, which makes it harder for the officer who has a bigger unit to hold. What's your thoughts? I know, Gary, you have raised your hand.
Yeah, the last 2 years, I've done some consulting for 2 jails in Virginia. I'm not going to say which ones they were, but they were built in the late 60s, and they're on multiple floors, the old iron bar jails, and they have seg cells and dead-end hallways and all that. And both jails, I noticed, had good supervisors where when the staff needed checks to be done or a helping hand, the supervisors got out of their offices, away from their desks, and did it. So the supervisor's going to have to help too. One of the things that I talk about in my suicide prevention class is that everybody that wears a uniform is still an officer. So if you're working canteen, or you're working inmate records, or you're working IT, you're wearing a uniform, you're walking down a hallway, and there's supposed to be 15-minute checks. Nothing is stopping you from turning your head right or left and looking in on them.
I love that. Yeah, Gary, you're 100% correct. When I was a supervisor, I made sure I did my rounds, but I also told the officers, like, some officers would maybe slow up and not do their round because they knew I was coming. And I'm saying, listen, guys, I'm partnering what you have to do, but the thing is, I'm not counted as your tour either. Like, I'll come in and assist, but now if I'm coming at this time, and all of a sudden you pull back and stop doing what you need to do because you figure that you're going to count my tour as your own.
That's something that should be addressed at a roll call. And the supervisors, either the head of the jail or the head of the squad, gets up there and says, hey, we're short-staffed. So everybody, here's our list of special observations. You're traveling in those areas. Make sure you look in on them. If you see something that's not kosher, or the person sitting there crying, or they're making God forbid, they're making a noose or something like that. I mean, tell the staff, tell the post officer what you got.
Well said. Anybody else want to finish off that? We'll go to the next one. We have 2 more questions left. All right, here we go.
Did you get your coffee?
No, she's still trying to put the kids to sleep. So, but I want you to know something. So I guess there's a win-win. I'm going to show you a text you just sent. Hold on. This is what she said. I'm sorry, babe. It's real upsetting. I just can't leave. Every time I leave the room, the kids start to scream. But as soon as I can, I will get your coffee. And I said, I'm sorry, babe. No worries. I know it's tough tomorrow. I can maybe do it. Which means she probably thinks I said maybe I can help put the kids to sleep. What I meant to say was maybe I can get the coffee tomorrow. Let her figure that out. You know what I mean? So, okay, hold on.
Ain't no way Tony's helping with them kids.
No way. They scream. Sienna's tough. All right. Can saving a life lead to discipline? It's third shift. Officer Johnson reports to his post and is early for duty. The shift exchange takes place when Officer Johnson begins his rounds. As Officer Johnson tours his unit, something strikes the corner of his eye as he passes inmate Smith's cell. As Officer Johnson gets a little closer, he notices that inmate Smith has a sheet around his neck with the other end tied to the grill gate and is trying to take his own life. Officer Johnson quickly calls the code, but there's no response. He tries again, still nothing. He calls it in by phone, and the shift commander tells him that there's another active code, one inmate assaulting another inmate in a cell, and the response team is tied up. At this point, Officer Johnson hangs up the phone and opens the cell to get the inmate in question. The inmate is quickly brought down and saved by Officer Johnson. The team arrives to assist, but sees the situation is under control. The supervisor enters the scene to assess the situation and notices the grill gate was already open. He tells Officer Johnson that he should have waited for the response team and his actions could have easily sacrificed the safety and security of the institution. Officer Johnson tells the supervisor, if I would have waited, the inmate would have died, so I had to make a choice to act. The supervisor quickly reminds Officer Johnson that he violated policy by opening the cell without backup. He continues to state that this is a major security breach and Officer Johnson's actions cannot be taken lightly. As the head of administration, the issue is now brought to you for immediate action. Officer Johnson states he acted with the best intentions. The inmate was going to hang himself. The response team at that time was handling another situation. Therefore, he could not wait and let the inmate die. The supervisor in return states that Officer Johnson's action violated safety and security. Officer Johnson should have waited for backup before he decided to open the cell door. Officer Johnson clearly violated policy and his actions must be addressed before someone else does the same. You take a second to think. Can a policy be violated to save an inmate's life? At this point, what holds more weight, safety or security? You have to make a decision. What do you decide, Gary?
Okay. I always think that, you act to save human life, inmate, or staff. First of all, I would tell Officer Johnson, yes, you violated policy. Okay, get that out of the way. You violated policy. Fortunately, it turned out good. It turned out well. Nobody died. But I would get my training folks together, and in Fairfax, we had a training committee, and say, okay, this is a perfect scenario of what can happen and how are we going to prepare for it, because things in jails and prisons don't happen like dominoes, the first one, and then it falls into the second one, and it falls into the third one. It doesn't work that way. So I would say, yeah, technically, yes, you violated policy. Fortunately, you were not hurt. The inmate lived, but this is a wake-up call, okay? This is definitely a wake-up call.
I love that, Gary. Very objective. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Well, I think that this is one of those, clearly damned if you do, damned if you don't. The problem here is that it's really easy to write, a nice happy ending, and the inmate lived. And so now we're going to have outcome-based policies. You can't do it. That's not the purpose of a policy. A policy is to give you guidance, that's absent, all these extemporaneous situations and the totality of it, This time it turned out good. What about the next time when it doesn't? So, I'm all for, let this inmate get his, not inmate, this officer get his slap on the wrist or whatever.
That's what I meant, yeah.
But you just can't have, this outcome-based situational thing. Policy has to be clear. There has to be a reason behind it. It has to be a compelling reason that keeps everybody safe. We can write a different ending to this story about how this officer went into the cell and the inmate had it rigged up and faked, and there was some soap on the floor and the officer slipped and the inmate came down off of his garret, his noose that he had, and stabbed the officer 16 times and killed him. Then what do we have?
Right. I like the fact that you also mentioned the worst case scenario, and that's what the supervisor's thinking. You and Gary said the same exact thing. We're lucky this time. But again, my concern is the universal precaution. I mean, is this something you're going to discipline the officer on, even though they know the intent is good? But I'm going to get to Greg, but I'm going to tell you my response to this one. Usually I wanted to give you the response. I didn't want to give you my responses, but there's a reason why this question was made. And I'll tell you why I also pointed at administration on something like this. But we'll go to Greg first. What's your thoughts, Greg? See if anyone picks it up. I'm looking for something particular, but so far it hasn't been picked up yet.
We actually trained on this very scenario in the prison system because an officer did go in and he was assaulted, as Russ pointed out. The policy is there to protect me, to protect my staff, and I am there to protect the inmates to the best of my ability. but it was absolutely driven into stone that we don't open any cell door without a second officer there in those situations. We just had that one in Cook County that Tony and I just reviewed where an officer opened the door and sure enough got assaulted.
Yeah.
He didn't think through the process. So yes, we have an inmate who is committing suicide. He is in the process, or at least he appears to be, but you have to wait for backup. Now, let me point out that I was that officer who did get his butt chewed for stepping into situations without a backup team. I got a reputation amongst the inmates as not being afraid to step in because I did get in the middle of a couple of fights without backup there because you just react and you learn from those things and you realize, oops, that's not the thing to do. So you have to wait because you've got to protect yourself. It's more important for you to go home at the end of the day than it is anything else. And I don't want to see something happen to you. You need to wait for the backup. Yes, protection of life is absolutely critical. We are there to protect the offenders. But in this particular case, I'm going to give the guy probably 3 days off because he's going to have to go to the Red Cross certificate because he's going to get a life-saving certificate anyway. You know, he's going to get in the newspaper and he's going to get a reward for saving the inmate's life, but he can have 3 days off in the process.
This, but you know what's funny is the reason why this scenario hits home is I know of a situation, I'll just say it that way, where it happened. And the response team obviously just was delayed, and the officer did what they had to do. It was a legit attempt, though. So when it was challenged, the question was brought up was, well, you know, we want to save lives. A lot of us are in this profession to do that, so we're motivated to do that. So it's very hard for us to watch someone kill themselves and not be able to react and prevent that. So how can we as administration eliminate that motivation? And the thought was, well, if you can't open up the cell without backup, then the backup is the ones that can bring the keys. This way, it stops the motivation from the officer wanting to go in and also doesn't violate policy. So to me, that was a great idea. It was a way to just to balance that motivation with policy and basically just don't give that officer the key. If the response team comes, that's why I specifically said for third shift, the response team will bring the key. And therefore, that officer won't be motivated to violate policy because, again, you know, God forbid he opens it up and like Russ and Gary said, or like yourself, it just wasn't what it was what it was supposed to be. It wasn't a suicide. Any comments on that before we go to the last question? All right, this is something similar, but a different perspective. Officer John Smith's a unit officer. Okay, last question, guys. He's a unit officer. He works in a dorm setting that requires frequent tours. Before Smith does his tour, he must first wait for another officer to enter his area. Smith will then hand over his keys for security reasons and then enter the dorm. Once Smith enters the dorm, the second officer will then secure the dorm, locking Smith in. Today, as Smith tours the dorm, an inmate is out of his bed area. As Smith approaches the inmate to order him back to his bed area, the inmate becomes hostile and attacks Smith. This all occurs in direct view and only a few feet away of the second officer who now has the keys to enter the dorm and aid the officer in need. Even though a code has been called, the second officer, feeling that he has to act immediately, enters the dorm and aids the officer in need. The response team comes, led by a supervisor, and is able to get directly into the affected area, maintain control, and save the officer. As they're writing their reports, the supervisor realizes he has an issue. The second officer who assisted Smith was in violation of policy and procedure. When that officer went to assist Smith, he jeopardized the safety and security of not just the unit, but the prison. Even though the supervisor knows what the second officer did was wrong, he knows why he did it and decides not to write up the officer. Again, the supervisor is aware that what the second officer did was a direct violation of policy and procedure and could have seriously jeopardized the security of the prison as a whole. Do you think the supervisor was correct in doing so, or should the officer have been disciplined? Share your thoughts in the comments box below. Share your thoughts. Okay, Rush, you want to go first with this one?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, this is one of those ones that kind of irks me because I've been around, you know, some similar policies and procedures like this in corrections where, you know, I've just basically, you know, been handed two options that are both bad and both of them are crap. Why can't administrators, you know, in a situation like this, write me some policy that gives me a way out, a way to make a good choice instead of a poor choice. You know, it's easy to just say someone, you have to do only X and never Y, but we're not going to give you, you know, an extra person to walk around with you. We're not going to give you an extra piece of equipment that can help you get out of that jam. We're not going to give you a way to open that door electronically so both of you can go through and patrol that area. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to tell you, you know what, if anything bad happens in there, tough shit. Man, don't give me policies and procedures like that. Give me something I can work with. Give me something, and I'll take it back to the last one we did too. That one maybe not as much, but there's still other ways to get things accomplished. Don't just leave me with, you know, one or two bad choices. Give me a range of good choices to pick from. I'll do you right.
Right, and you know what, Russ? Something that you said is key. Sorry, guys, as we're doing that, someone from Charleston, Missouri is texting me, said they had 3 positive cases as of 2 days ago. Sometimes people will give me information so we can keep up with it, and obviously our hearts go out to our people as well out in Missouri. You're right. I like what you said about that. I never thought about that before, but that electronic thing where that should have been controlled from someone above, and therefore you could safely walk with 2 officers and 1 officer, you know, you have each other's back. Unfortunately, here with these understaffed facilities, this is a real issue. This is what's happening. Limited staffing and 1 officer going down a door when there should at least be 2 and 1 in the sky, minimal 2 and 1 in the sky. In this case here, when this scenario was created, it was a limited shift, 3rd shift, and the officer's walking down there alone, being secured in, while the other officer watches, you know, the tour. But well, I'll wait till after you guys are done because I want to add a little caveat to this. But I don't want to bias what your answers are going to be. So, Gary, you go next. What's your thoughts on that?
I agree with Russ. You know, this is a pretty crappy situation where the officer wanted to help his fellow officer, and by the book, he shouldn't have done that, and so forth. But yeah, you got to work up a better policy than this. You do, yeah.
So Gary, in this case here, though, would you believe that the supervisor should write up the officer?
I would take some action, I guess, technically, but I wouldn't ruin the guy's career over this. No.
That's well said, by the way. Well balanced, Gary. It's not an easy question.
No, it's
Greg,
not.
I want to add something to that, though, by the way, when we're done with Greg's perspective. I have another caveat.
Well, we've all mentioned that it's bad policy. We need electronic doors. There's things. Being a vendor who comes into these facilities, 90% of the time, the reason they call me and bring our system online is because, well, they've had a death in custody or they failed their audit. We get brought in because of a failure like this, because of a catastrophic failure. The reason they changed from key doors to electronic doors. Why did we do that? Well, because we had a catastrophic failure. Why did we have to fix all the food tray slots in the max unit? Well, because we opened a door, because the food tray slots didn't work. The only reason administrators and county commissioners spend money a lot of time is because we've had a catastrophic failure. So staying ahead of the curve helps these problems. But we did have units like this. I do remember this exact happening where I went in to do a head count, actually, a 48-man unit. The officer with the keys, he stood at the gate, and I had to go in and count the 48 inmates. And I'm in the back of the unit, I'm counting. Well, it wasn't an assault on me. It was 2 inmates started fighting. So the response wasn't great, but the officer at the gate, he turned and threw the keys down the hallway as far away from the unit as possible, and then he ran in. So the keys weren't in the unit, but I did have a backup officer. So that worked out okay. But as far as do I want to write the officer up? No. Am I going to? Yes. But what I say in there is not going to be a career-changing day. It's what a supervisor that I used to have, one of my mentors said, there are day-changing moments and career-changing moments. Let's call this a day-changing moment. You get your butt chewed, remember to follow policy, you might get a slap on the wrist, but this isn't going to be a career-changing moment. I'm not going to crush him over this.
I actually like that. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, I know early in my career, there was a linear floor at the Fairfax jail with 18 cell blocks. And it was just, and we were short staffed and it was just me up there and we had to do cleanup. I had to have 2 cell blocks open at the same time across from each other. And I was always thinking, what if I get jumped or what if I get attacked? And it's just me. And you got to have, like I've always said, the people wearing the bars and the stripes and the oak leaves and the eagles, they have to come up with some good training and policy. They have to be proactive because this kind of thing can happen when you're short-staffed.
I want to
Let
add
me
a
just
little
say
twist.
one thing.
Okay, Gray.
Gary, you mentioned it before, and I want to add on to that. Absolutely, the people with the hardware on their collars need to be the ones writing smart policy. But the thing that happens too many times with officers, as soon as they get promoted, they forget where they came from.
Exactly.
So good supervisors, great administrators remember where they came from. And they're not afraid to listen to those people and remember that what it was like to be on the front lines. Don't just lock yourself in an office anymore. Don't just get behind a computer and work about paperwork. No, remember those folks walking up and down the tiers. Those are the folks that still run the jail.
The best jail, thanks, Greg. The best jail supervisors I had were the ones where you'd knock on the door of their office and their swivel chairs empty because they're out walking around and seeing what's going on. So, yeah, I agree with that. Oh, you got your coffee there.
Just
Hey, Tony,
having
quick
some
question.
coffee.
Tony, you get that at Disney World?
Yeah, I did actually.
That's your Disney World cup. That's the free refillable cup you get when you go there.
He's
I got
economizing.
I have a caveat there, but I did get my coffee. I'm just saying thank you to the wife. Hold on. I'm just saying thanks. Hey, here's a caveat. Let me tell you what happened here. So for this case here, and I do want to get your perspective before we close, because there's a little bit of a perspective from the person who actually did violate the policy. I want you to know something. The officer that went to protect this other officer's life, he knew what the policy was. He knew he wasn't supposed to go in there, right? And he also knew that there could have been a risk. At any point, he could have went in there and someone could have took his keys and whatever. So he knew that. The reason why he went in there, though, was because he said if he didn't go in there to save that officer's life, besides the guilt if something was to happen, was how other people would have viewed him. So other officers would have looked at him, and they wouldn't give a shit about policy. The first thing they would say was, well, screw policy. You should have went in there. And they just would not have understood the fact that he was going to abide by policy, knowing that there's a bigger threat. But he said the peer pressure of what he thought he could have faced motivated him to say, you know what, I'll take the charge, knowing that he violated policy. So I see you acknowledging that, Greg. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there is absolutely, and the four of us know this hands down. People who've never walked inside the walls don't understand. Those who've served overseas in the military, and thank you for your support and what you've done, those who served in the military, they understand it. Those who've worked the emergency as EMT partners, going on paramedic runs, they'll understand it. But folks who've worked on shift together get it, that you are arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, locked in. And if you are ever viewed as the guy who didn't respond, you suddenly went code black when everybody else was responding, you didn't respond, you absolutely become an outcast on that shift. So, yeah, I can see that point because you're expected to have somebody six at any moment.
But now on another perspective of that, the supervisor who even writes up that officer, even just the subtlest, is also going to be considered an outsider. So I just wanted to get that perspective in because that could be a reason why people may violate the policy, knowing that their peers would have said, well, I would have jumped in and saved that officer. What's your thoughts on that, Gary, from that perspective?
I agree with Greg on that too. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you have to prepare for moments like this, and you never know when they're going to come about.
And these are questions that are not easy because it's not black and white. It's not a yes or no. Hey, Russ, what's your thoughts from both perspectives, from the peer pressure that this officer could have later faced, but also what about the pressure that the supervisor is going to face for maybe having to write the officer up?
You know, from one perspective, that's just, you know, part of what we have to deal with being in the job that we're in. From another perspective, though, you know, I would like to think that the people that are, you know, writing the policies and designing the procedures and taking a look at the physical layouts and the things that we're capable of, the equipment we carry, the responses we're going to have, all of that stuff, you know, they need to be cognizant of not just those things, but they need to be cognizant of the world we work in and how those things interplay. And that's why they really should be giving us, you know, better options to choose from. You know, this thing doesn't happen inside a vacuum where, you know, it's just, you know, automatically choice A leads to result B. That's not really the way it goes. They should be taking into consideration, you know, the people we work with and the kind of buddy system that we have, and how, you know, we're held to a position of, you know, having to, you know, justify ourselves to the people that we work with. And the same thing goes with that person that has to write that. Let's try and not put that position or that person into that position where they have to make that bad choice and write that person up. Let's make it so this thing didn't happen this way altogether, that we gave them, you know, an option. Instead of option A or option B, we have C, D, E, F. You know, maybe there's a locker that they could have thrown those keys into, gone on in and responded from that point. Something. Work with us here. Give me something that I can take into battle, come out victorious, and have everybody win, instead of, you know, just the select chosen few at the top that can sit there and cast aspersions because they weren't there at the moment.
Right, and I also like to add a little bit of education too, as to making sure people are aware. Like let's say the officer decided not to violate policy. Let's say they decided to wait for the response team. Then I would think that administration would have to do what they can to show support to what that officer did, because you know that officer is going to be hounded with negativity from his peers. So maybe there's a way that could be balanced off by support or some form of education to say why that officer had to do what they had to do, so the officer is not labeled as a coward, if you will. All right, guys. So it was
Tony,
today just to kind of.
Tony,
go ahead, Greg.
Tony, the term is not coward.
Oh,
it's a blue falcon. For those of you who know what that term is.
Really? I never heard that.
You've never heard that term?
No.
Okay, so a person who turns in their buddy or turns their back on their buddy is called a blue falcon, and actually it's a military term, and it's not blue falcon, it's buddy with the same initials. You're a buddy with the same as falcon. So I don't want to say it. I mean, I know we said bitch earlier, but I'm not going that far on your YouTube channel. But yeah, when you turn your back on your team, you're a blue falcon or BF or a buddy. So right. Now your listeners got a new term today.
Yeah, well, I think we learned a lot today. Now, guys, it was good to take a break away from the coronavirus. We've been covering a lot. I just wanted a breather. Obviously, you know, we're all dealing with it. So it's good to take a break. Probably later in the week we'll get back with some more updates. I just thought, you know, once in a while we could go take a break and go back to what this channel was about. You know, I mean, everything is still important, because even though we're going through the coronavirus, the career, the profession, it still has these issues on top of the coronavirus. So I kind of felt, me and Russ were talking about this before, but we kind of felt guilty of doing episodes where, an officer has a problem with a supervisor, and our usual dialogue amongst the chaos that we have. But I also think that's what attracts people to this channel, is those dialogues that are very insightful. So amongst the chaos, we wanted to bring a little bit of that back. And today, even though we covered a lot of scenarios, these scenarios were informative by the way they were designed, and then obviously by the way the experts were able to respond. And it was just a breakaway from what's happening. But again, not to minimize or negate what's happening, just we all need a breather. So anybody like to say stuff in closing? So Gary, would you like to say anything in closing to our audience? Maybe promote some of your books?
Well, thank you, Anthony. It's always a pleasure, and I'm in good company here. thank you guys for your service. Thank you for mentioning my books. They're on Amazon. Art of the Con, Avoiding Offender Manipulation, 2nd edition, and the Correctional Officer Practical Guide, 3rd edition. They're on Amazon. Also, I'm working right now, since I'm using this time, that we're all sequestered. I'm revising my book, Stressed Out, Living and Working with Stress and Correction, 2nd edition. I'm working on the 3rd edition, be out later this year. So, yeah, I'm doing webinars, stuff like that. So I appreciate you bringing me on and giving me a voice. And
Yeah, well,
God bless the people out there in the jails and prisons. We need you, and stay safe.
I'll tell you something. I've been a big fan of Gary for a long time. His book, Art of the Con, is what opened me up to inmate manipulation. I believe it's chapter 4. Inmate manipulation, Art of the Con. Is it chapter 4?
I think so. Yeah.
It is. I know that book like the back of my hand. How Gary does the books that I've read is it's text partnered with experience. You're not going to get that at any school. It's basically our experience structured in a text format, and they're very, very informative. If you're new to the field, or if you are been in the field for a while, there's still so much that you can learn. And again, have Gary on the show with with all the books that you've done. It's an honor, because you still have someone that has left the field. What, 15 years ago? You left in what, 2005?
Well, you said before I was real old, so yeah, it was 2005. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, but to still be so actively involved in the field.
Well, I appreciate that, Anthony. I do.
It's true. You've been still 15 years on top of that after you retired, and you're molding minds, which ultimately, when these people enter the profession, it makes our life a lot safer, because the more information people have going into the profession helps the experience mold them to where they need to be. So
it's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, let's not minimize the hard work you do. Great job, Gary. Thank you. If you guys have a chance, please check out his book. I would definitely recommend Art of the Con. I would definitely recommend his books on stress. But he also has a practical guide to being a correctional officer. So a lot of people that follow my channel that are new, this is a worthy investment. It's broken down, it's structured, and it answers everything from, departmentally being custody, safety, and security, but also interactions with other departments, explains their roles. And if you want to make this a career and you're looking to move up from starting point to the top, it's great for you to learn what the system's about outside of just your departmental or myopic perspective. So thank you, Gary, for all the stuff that you've done for this profession. Greg, anything you'd like to say in closing?
Well, since we're all just promoting ourselves shamelessly, great job, by the way, Gary. Guardian RFID right there.
Yay, Guardian.
Feel free to go to our YouTube channel and hit that bell. Because a lot of Tony's stuff, it not only appears on his side, but it also appears on the Guardian RFID website as well. Plus, you might get a couple of videos, some babblings of a guy who looks remarkably like me. That would be me. So we've got quite a few videos we're putting out as well. We've got some great content. We have a new video we just did about saluting those who've put themselves on the line during this coronavirus. It's about, about a minute and a half, 2 minutes long. Absolutely bald like a baby. Our videographer did just a tremendous job. So we've got some success stories. Just a good channel for corrections folks to pop in and see what's going on. Just another avenue. But subscribe to our channel. Also, you can email me if you have any questions about what I do or about some scenarios. Greg@guardianrfid.com. Happy to help. And just out there for folks trying to do my #1 mantra: get your team home safe.
Hey, you made a good point real quick. And I want to compliment something else with Guardian RFID. But Gary Cornelius, do you have your email?
Yeah, I do. It's ADJ, that's A Alpha D David J John. ADJ Alpha David John, the letters, instructor, the word instructor, @hotmail.com.
Right. And so if you guys have any questions or anything, or interested in getting Gary's books, you can email him directly. He can tell you how to do it. But I believe you can get your books on Amazon and stuff. But
yes, yeah.
Gary does get back to all his emails. So, and if you have any scenarios you want to run by, Gary's always looking for people with experience to have some input in what he writes, which is amazing. He hasn't forgotten where that experience comes from, that front line. And also, just going back to compliment a little bit on Guardian before we go to Russ. I've worked with those filmographers. We're working on a project still with Megan Callahan. We're waiting for the court dates to come. They are dedicated. They just, I don't know if it's the company Guardian itself, but their belief in the profession, it's hard to say unless you're there with them. I don't have the words. I think words would just minimize it. They're so dedicated to what we're doing and so dedicated to the story that needs to be told. And their YouTube channel it's not about the business, guys. It's about how you can make things safer. I give them stuff all the time that they promote. But again, I don't promote Guardian. I promote whatever message I decide. Hey guys, we got to learn this. We got to learn that. And it's just good roundabout information that if you get a chance, you should check it out because it gives you knowledge that you need to provide this profession, but it also shows you a team who's willing to support us and do whatever they can to get that recognition we deserve. And when he mentioned that video about heroes, they did not forget, or even they basically made the main focus of that corrections. Now, guys, I believe in all our first responders, don't get me wrong, but all because I fight to have corrections seen doesn't mean I minimize the other first responders. It's just that corrections is never seen. So I just want to make sure that that's my standpoint, that people are reminded of us. It's not to say, oh, we're better than this, that. No, we're equal. And I'm making sure that we're brought to that table and we could sit down and eat with them. That's the key. Russ, what's your thoughts? Closing.
I just got to say that I really loved this little bit that we just did. I think that this is very instructional and very helpful for those that, whether they've just started or they've got years in, for them to be able to, see and, trigger some things in their head to start thinking about, scenarios and critical incidents and see how other people respond to it, how other people think about it. I'm really jazzed about this particular venue, this particular, edition of Tier Talk.
Well, now check this out. Now that Russ has mentioned it, obviously we're open to more questions or scenario based. I'm sure Russ and Greg, whatever, they'll email me some more. I just don't want you guys seeing each other's. I want to be surprised with. That's what makes it unique. Also, Saturday, my brave Warriors have another homework assignment that you better not have forgotten about that. So, I mean, if Gary wants to get involved, he can get involved. Let me just tell you something, just in case, because it's open up to anybody. Excuse me. It's open up to anybody who really wants to get involved in this. So, one of my passions was, and Russ remembers us doing this years ago, where I wanted to make a correctional news program where basically, I didn't like the way the media was covering us. So what I wanted to do was to put our people on the field and cover stories that could give that true life perspective. Now, fortunately, I don't have a budget. I can't do that. But with that said, with the help of Zoom, I'm able to share content. So what we're going to do Saturday, and hopefully I'll have it posted by Saturday or Sunday, is each one, Connie, Greg, Russ, Soto, there's a bunch of us. If Gary wants to get involved, he can get involved. We all have a story. Now, we don't know what we're each covering. We have no idea. The only person that's probably going to know about it will be me eventually because I'm the one that's going to have to showcase it. But everybody's going to put together a story about 10 to 15 minutes long. Probably 10 minutes if it's a vlog, 15 minutes if they're interviewing somebody, whatever it is. Whatever story they want to tell. If they want to interview a hero, or if they want to talk about preventive measures for corona, whatever it is that they want to tell. And what we're going to do is this Saturday, we're going to have a dialogue and everybody's going to introduce their story and we're all going to watch it together, discuss it for about 5 minutes and go to the next story. And I'm very excited. I'm actually waiting for my guest that I'm trying to get on. They're going to let me know by tomorrow if they're able to do it. But we're going to put together maybe some tips or whatever it is. Like I'll give mine away a little bit. I'm working on this. I don't know if it can happen, but I'm working on getting a female supervisor to tell me what it's like to be a supervisor in a male facility. So a quick little 10-minute dialogue. I'm going to go to that story. We'll discuss it, and then Greg will introduce his story. And we're going to try to do this at least twice a month. They'll send me the videos, and I'm able to play the video right through here, and we're going to do it as a live feed. That means we're going to be going live Saturday night, and we're going to be sharing the stories that we worked hard to tell. And again, I'm choosing to do an interview. I believe Greg is reaching out probably to somebody. I don't. Yeah, and I think Russ has probably got something. The vlogs, if it's just you giving out some tips, we'll keep that to 10 minutes. If it's you interviewing, we could do that for 15 minutes. But I think it's going to be interesting. If Gary wants to get involved in that, by all means, I would love to have you. If not this time, maybe next time. But remember, you have a book about stress, so maybe it'd be good to bring on somebody who's dealt with stress and share their story. But I'm very excited for this. Now, guys, in my closing, guys, this was a fun dialogue. We're probably going to do this again to develop more scenarios. And kind of break away from what's going on. But again, just in times we have right now, I want everybody to stay safe. I know the numbers are growing. I know we're trying to get to that peak point I'm dealing with right now in northern New Jersey. It's bad. But as I said, we can get through this. We just got to stay strong, do whatever we could to protect our families. If you're not feeling good, don't come to work because, a headache is a lot more nowadays than just a headache. But the key here is that we can only protect each other if we protect ourselves first. And I think that's the key. If you're not feeling good, don't go to work. All right, guys, as always, the show is Tier Talk. Love you guys. Don't forget to subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.